at 11. Why don't we start? We have 10 people. Hi to the listeners, and most importantly, hi Bertrand, and awesome to have you on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Do you have a lag, or can you hear me all right?
I hear you very good.
Okay, maybe it's a lag on my side. Bertrand, so I love talking to you anyway, and this is now a conversation about tariffs that you and I seem to be slightly obsessing over. But it's also great to have you on the Ethical Procurement Edge podcast, because one of my aims for this podcast is to equip the procurement professionals with pragmatic and practical strategies to do supplier, and supply chain resilience, cost saving, create a competitive advantage without actually compromising on ethics. So having you here talking about tariffs and how they specifically impact procurement and what they practically can do to protect themselves and be ahead of the game if it's at all possible with Trump is really great. So thanks again for agreeing to be my guest here, and good to have you.
No problem. Always, I've been working in procurement for quite a long time. I wouldn't say forever, but for a long time, and I'm really passionate about the function, what it can do in terms of the impact it has on the planet at the end of the day, because every buying decision is shaping supply chain, and this is what is basically shaping the world in so that's why I'm always happy to talk about it. And tariff is one aspect of it, but there are so many that we can do that anytime.
Yeah, and actually, I was wondering, and maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit, but the segue is, I know you from Spend Matters, and I know you and love reading your analysis on all things technology. So you going deep into 3 episodes of tariffs surprised me, but elated me as well. But it was surprising because I know you from a tech angle. So maybe you can introduce yourself, but also then tell us why you decided to take on this, challenging and non-tech topic of tariffs.
Yeah, okay. Good question. So, as I said earlier, I've been I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I started long time ago, or what feels like a long time ago, in procurement. I would say by accident. I was working in something very technical, and I wanted to move from Turkey back to France, where I came from actually. And I was offered a procurement job, and I didn't know what it was, etc. But I discovered and I liked it. And then along that path, after being a buyer myself for a few years, then Obelix, I fell into the tech marmite, whatever. And I've never left it since then. So working on the practitioner side of things for a large company, trying to put some systems and processes in place, and I work for several providers, trying to help companies transform their procurement function through technology. And a few years ago, I was then invited to join Spend Matters, which I was waiting for years. And I became an analyst over there. And yeah, we cover tech. So to answer the second part of the question, we cover tech, obviously, a lot, because we're the only actually analyst firm specialized in procurement and supply chain. But I always say, and this is also what took me build my passion about tech in procurement. It's not just about tech. And actually, tech is often the last piece of the puzzle. It's a lot about people, behavior, change management, that kind of stuff, and processes. And tech is there to serve a purpose. And this is something I've been very interested in all along, that path I've described before. And this is why I've read about procurement, and I learned about procurement doing the job, about tech, reading stuff like Spend Matters back in the days, but also I read a lot about change management, behavioral economy, that kind of stuff, marketing, because you need to sell stuff, in ideas and change initiatives. And this is something we want to do more at Spend Matters is to cover the tech through the lens of the needs. And this is why I've written several series back in the days, somewhere on a topic that also close to your heart around human rights in the supply chain, explaining, the regulation and why it makes sense, and then how the tech can support. And for tariffs, when during the campaign, I think it's to answer the third part of your question. During the campaign in the US, Trump talked about tariffs and said stuff that I believe are not really true, connecting tariff inflation in some kind of strange ways, etc., etc. And I thought because it's a very current topic, it also connects quite a lot with procurement. We should write about it and start with what are tariffs, why it's important for procurement, what they can do about it, and then last but not least, how the tech supports or can support tariff management. So that's pretty much it.
Well, that is really good and helpful for us because not to jump ahead, we'd love to hear from you your suggestions of like pragmatic ways of staying ahead of it all. And technology, certainly with the amount of stuff and analysis that's needed, technology could play really a pivotal role to help procurement, right? To like number crunch and scenario plan and stuff. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just take a step back and think, okay, well, let's explain what is tariffs. And I don't know whether now or in a separate kind of question we'll tie in the migration policy, because in my opinion, he's playing the two cards together in one hand. So for the uninitiated, let's just demystify what tariffs are and what's he doing with them.
Yeah. So tariffs have been, let's say, in place and used for a long time. It's not related to Trump. That's an old thing that exists in the business world. And basically, tariffs are a very simple way to say any goods coming from country, so goods, a category of goods coming from that country, when they will be imported into my country, then there will be a tax to be paid, right? That's as simple as that. It's just a tax, right? So that you can go through custom and you can then have your goods offered locally on the market. And there are many reasons to raise tariffs. I will go to some of them. Some of them are like really, it's a way to protect your industries. If you think that, you have an industry that you want to protect and have people buy locally, then obviously tariffs raising the price of goods will be a way to create a beneficial influence on your local product. Could be also to generate revenue, because tax is revenue for the country, and influence the trade balance. And that's something that Trump is saying also. So it's been used for a long time to encourage local production and create some kind of like sometimes level playing field. If you think that a country has practices, and especially true like around sustainability, that kind of stuff, if a country does not have the same standards as you have, then you're gonna say we're gonna try to penalize those goods and put a tariff. It's like, if I do the parallel with CBAM, so the cross-border adjustment for carbon, that's kind of the same thing actually. And obviously, since it's a threat on countries that import goods into your country, which can jeopardize companies from those countries because their goods will be more expensive, so people will buy less, etc. It can also be used as a lever to negotiate, which is, I think, currently a lot of what Trump has been doing. If you think about Canada and Mexico, he said, okay, we're gonna be applying tariffs of 25% generally for Canada and Mexico, except for oil coming from Canada, but overall 25% tariff for stuff coming from Canada and Mexico. And I don't think, the reason was clearly stated. It's not really to protect local economy, the US economy, etc. The thing was around border control and fentanyl, where he was saying that it's a way for me to put pressure on Canada and Mexico so that they supposedly control better the borders, which we saw that then Canada and Mexico announced they would do some stuff, which apparently they had already agreed upon, but that's another story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then he said, okay, so you have 1 month more. So basically, I think 1st of March is going to reassess the situation and say if whether or not these 25% tariff apply. So that's why it's to manage your political agenda, and immigration is one.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I mean, I've been Googling, and I think tariffs are as old as the Silk Road, right? Like, you want to sell, you have to um, pay some kind of like gold coin to pass through a country or to sell in that market and stuff. So in itself is nothing new, and we work with them. And actually, they're really, really far-reaching, these tariffs, right? But Trump, as you said, he's playing a negotiation card, and he has a very aggressive and PR heavy, uh, you know, tariff strategy. Because tariffs, as I said, they've been around and people have them forever. It's nothing new. But the fact that he's put them up forward as something that he wants to be known for, and he's done it already. Could you maybe talk about, like, he's done them in his previous term, right? He's doing them now. He's doing them very publicly. He's going in for a fight. But like, what are the key elements? Obviously, there's a lot of noise about Canada and Mexico and fentanyl. And actually, as I said, you said Canada, there is no fentanyl going into the US from Canada, barely any. Like, I don't understand what he's even doing there. But apart from that, he has used it for Colombia. He has used it, and I don't know whether he's withdrawn it now for Colombia or not. He has done it for Mexico and Canada, but he's put also universal tariffs through. And obviously, he's addressing the relationship with China through tariffs. So could you maybe give us like a precise, what's the current tariff agenda?
The thing is that it's moving, it's a lot of moving pieces. And I said earlier, one thing that is also specific to Trump, it's a lot of announcement, uncertainty, doing things and going back, etc. And like between the last time we talked, the two of us, and today, like on Friday, there were further announcements, etc., etc. So it's and at this stage, nothing came into place. Actually, everything is being delayed. So we'll see. I think the key milestones will be beginning of March and beginning of April, because so regarding Canada and Mexico, it announced 25% tariffs across the board for any goods coming from Canada or Mexico. The only exception would be oil coming from Canada. That would be only 10% because he knows that. I mean, I guess he has understood that the US is still importing a lot of oil for some of the states in the north of the US from Canada. He also said that for China, there would be 10% on everything coming from China. And there are also other countries, and basically the new thing is what he announced on Friday, which is reciprocity of tariffs, which gonna include Europe and we could say any country, is where the administration is gonna look at how goods coming from the US, when they go into a country, how they are taxed, and we'll talk about that, so that basically the US apply the same tariff in the other way around. Because at the end of the day, one thing that is true is that the US, when you look at the global economy, has a very low tariff rates compared to India. India is one country in the world that has less tariffs overall, more protective. The EU has, I don't remember the number, I think it's on average, because it depends from category to category, but I think it's 12% or something like that. So yeah, and what they're gonna do, which is a bit surprising or puzzling, is to say that the US administration is gonna look on a country per country, the level of tariffs. So when US goods reach, let's say, the UK or where I'm living, Austria, how much tariff is applied. But they will also look at other factors that influence the selling price of US goods, which would be VAT, which is surprising because VAT is paid by everybody, local, domestic, all goods pay the same level of VAT, but they're gonna somehow look at that, and even currency impacts. So I think they're gonna have a secret sauce or something and come up with tariffs, and potentially by mixing tariffs, VAT, and some other factors, they could be quite significant actually. So this is supposed to happen. So they are currently launching the analysis, and what is said on Friday, which could change by next week or whatever, is that this would be applied April 1st. So April 1st is also.
Is it applied April 1st, or the agencies have to come back with the reports in April? Well, as you said.
the application of the tariff would be for April 1st, so they have to make the things before.
So it's interesting what you're saying, because yes, he's using tariffs as a negotiation lever. His rationale, whether it's whatever it is, whether it's a PR stunt or not, his rationale is to curb the amount of fentanyl coming into the country, and that's why he's putting the 10% overall tariffs on China as well as Canada. It's a bit of a tenuous link for me, as I said, not for Mexico, for the other countries. But you also picked up on something very interesting. So he is also penalizing countries for maybe not using the dollar or weakening the dollar or circumventing the dollar. So he is using tariffs for a much broader type of political influence, right?
Yeah.
And
negotiation and leverage.
Negotiation and leverage for these kind of reasons that he's putting forward. And fair enough. I mean, what he's saying about, I'm trying to find what it's called, the fair and reciprocal plan that he's announced, and saying, yeah, we actually don't impose as many tariffs as the US as some countries, so it's time for us to review them. Yeah, which is actually fair enough. You can't just say whatever Trump does is bad or good. We need to look at every individual element of it and try to make sense of it. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the migration policy tie-up to tariffs and see what your interpretation of it is. Because for me, as you know, from my human rights stance point of view, and with the amount of people I talk to, that even in procurement, when I run different panels that talk about temporary labor and issues that company in the US are going to have with blue collar workers, is huge in what he is doing now with the migration policy. So a lot of corporates actually feeling that it's maybe not that well thought through, because he's kind of shooting himself in the foot, because the US does rely on a lot of migrant and cheap labor in a lot of its industry. So what's your take on the migration policy?
But I agree with you, and I see also the comment from Alex. I will go on that around doing what he said he would do during the campaign. But I think this is totally true, and it's not just in the US. I mean, there is a whole thing around immigration, and overall, we know that a lot of jobs are done by people coming into the country, let's say illegally, and because first of all, they have to survive, etc., and they do a lot of jobs that nobody else wants to do. So this is really, a walking double razor, double-edged blade, or whatever you say in English. It's like, so I think at the end of the day, the common point between tariff policy using for the immigration agenda to have, and especially Canada and Mexico, because they have a border with the US, to do more to control the border. Usually with the EU, it's a bit more difficult. We don't have a border with the US and stuff. So I would say that the immigration is not the only agenda behind the tariffs. But for Canada and Mexico, that's one of them. And I think the common point between the immigration policy and the tariff would be inflation. Because he was also elected during the campaign and saying that on day one he would fight inflation, price would go down, etc., which they haven't. And actually in January was one of the highest inflation since a few quarter or whatever. And I think this is where, and to go back to the chat of Alex saying that what he's doing right now is what he announced during the campaign. That's true, but the thing that and this is also one of the reasons why we started to write that things on Spend Matters, and I was passionate about it, is to say you cannot say that tariff, I don't remember which word they used, but that beautiful thing, wonderful thing, and that they're going to collect tax and going to use that tax to suppress other taxes and price will go down, etc. Because one of the tariffs and also the immigration policy, it's that basically it's creating potentially inflation, because when you import stuff, you pay a tax. So that tax, if you have a 25% tariff on something that costs 100, then it's 125. So companies could say we won't apply the 20 plus 25 fully to the consumer, but I don't see prices staying at 100 if there is an import tax of 25, right? So I think this is tariffs and immigration and inflation will be potentially the adjustment factor, because I think if there is another month, another quarter with inflation, then probably we'll start to see some reactions.
Let's talk about retaliation policies, because obviously he's coming out with a negotiation ploy, like in procurement. You're coming up with your opening bid, but other people are also not sitting back. And I'm actually observing that Mexico and Canada are much more sophisticated now in their negotiation policies towards Trump 1.0 than 2.0. They kind of said, okay, it all happened before. He's done these threats to us before, so we're going to negotiate much smarter with him than we did in the last term he's been around. But the retaliatory game or position is certainly there. I understood that China is already imposing retaliatory tariffs. And there's also a conversation that the EU will do the same, because I think that he's imposed or is planning to impose tariffs on steel, right? So what research and insights do you have on this position of retaliation? And what are the industries that you think are most at risk in that area?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think also one difference, and before answering that question, one difference between what I would call Trump, so the first time he was president, and Trump 2, which is now. Trump 1, he already applied tariffs, but it was very selective, mostly China, specific categories of goods. And the huge difference right now, it's tariffs across the board. It's like everything coming from Canada, everything coming from Mexico, everything coming potentially from India, from Europe would have 25 or whatever percent that's going to be. So it's really across the board, not as selective as it was before. And also a key difference is that Trump 1 was really more or less focused on China, and Trump 2 is like the first countries we've seen tariffs announced. It's so Canada and Mexico. Allies and business partners. And the funny thing is that it's also Canada, USA, and Mexico. They have a trade agreement. USMCA, so for US, Mexico, and Canada, which was basically negotiated by Trump 1. So, and he said that's the worst agreement ever, and that one has replaced NAFTA, which he had said back in the day that's the worst agreement ever. So it's kind of one of a big change, and this is where the retaliation game is going to be a bit different, is that every country is potentially a target, even traditional business partners and friendlies, let's say. Like the US, Mexico and Canada, or the EU. And obviously, countries are still investigating ways to retaliate, because again, there is no real tariff applying, because it's been postponed for US, for Mexico and Canada. For the other countries, we said beginning of April, etc. So it's still not clear. US steel and aluminum is probably another story, but it's not still in application. So I think countries are trying to analyze what the US would do, what would that mean, and how they can respond to it. So you have different ways to respond. We'll talk about tariff, but one thing I wanted to talk about, it's called export control. It's a way for your country to either forbid or put barriers, that could be paperwork or whatever, for exports. And China has played a lot of that game. In the US too, around AI and raw materials, because China is rich with rare earth materials, which are needed for development of chips or solar energy, etc. So there is also a game in terms of export controls, which can be a way to reply to tariffs. So export control does not mean taxes or whatever, but it means a more difficult access to certain materials or raw materials or components. So meaning that for supply chain could be potentially bottlenecks and that kind of stuff. And for the responses, obviously we'll see what the EU would do, etc. But I would say that some industries like the automotive sector, especially considering USMCA zone, so Canada, US, and Mexico, a lot of cars actually sold in the US are actually produced in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So will they be subject to tariffs? That's one question. Mexico could also, and Canada also announced some things around stopping import of some goods coming from the US, which is another way also to respond to tariffs. So you buy locally because it's kind of a boycott. So you see already on social media with people in Canada and in supermarket, stuff with a big Canadian flag on it to say that's from Canada, don't buy the US product, buy the Canadian product. Energy would be a sector, obviously, with tariffs on oil, etc. With China, liquefied natural gas could be also one area within the energy sector that could be impacted with some other, let's say, retaliatory measures from China. And we talked about some critical raw materials coming out of China. So that's, I think for now, it's still a bit too soon to really understand what would be the answers, because the application of the tariff is not there yet. And a lot of countries like the EU does not know yet what those tariffs will mean.
Can you update me? Because when I did the research, it came up to me that the steel and aluminium tariffs are actually already going to be applied on everybody, including the EU. Yeah. So he's doing tariffs on like finished goods, like consumer goods, and he's also doing tariffs on raw materials, right? And the impact of it is something we will not know as end consumers. We will only know once we become short of a raw material that will go, oh my God, we didn't realize we needed that for that. Like chips for microwaves, all that stuff. So steel and aluminium is definitely something that we know is going to be applied to. We think, and you've said, automotive industry is certainly going to be hammered. Energy. Consumer goods from China, anything coming from China into the US, made in China, is going to be 10 to 25% more expensive, as you said. Like, we don't know actually how much more expensive. Depends on, all these other, as you said, export controls and all these other challenges. Okay, so with all,
like I was, so like aluminum, so any aluminum that's going to be imported from whatever into the US would be taxed 25%. So obviously that does not mean that the price of goods will rise by 25%, because aluminum is just one part. If you think about, I was reading something about, the Coke or beer container is made of aluminum, so it will get cheaper, but that doesn't mean that a kind of Coke or beer or whatever will get 25% more expensive for the US, in the US. But Coca-Cola is, for example, looking at, using less aluminum and using more plastic for the bottles to fight that. And obviously, so this is where it's quite complex for procurement people, because again, tariff, they expose you as a company for when you sell your product to the US, because technically speaking, it will make your product potentially more expensive to the US consumer. So the US consumer could decide to buy less of your product. So that's the sales exposure. And for procurement people, that means that every good that is purchased. So if I'm a buyer in the US, so technically aluminum could be 25%. If I'm a buyer from Coca-Cola, let's say, or Budweiser or whatever, then I know that aluminum is going to be more expensive. So the company that makes the cans will sell them more expensive, not plus 25%. But if I'm a buyer, I need to understand how much aluminum goes in there. So if aluminum makes plus 25%, how much does the finished can does, so that I have that information, I can pass that to my organization, and the organization is going to decide to either increase the price of Coke or Budweiser or whatever or not. And the thing is that there is that mechanism, and this is where you need as a buyer to understand where you buy things, what do you buy from where, because again, tariffs, it's the crossroad of a country, a geography, a country, and a category of goods. So the 101 is to understand your spend. What am I buying from where, and then understand the tariff game that goes around that. But you also need to go beyond that, because your supplier may be buying stuff. If you think like you have your company, Victoria, based in the UK, and I'm in Austria, and I'm buying stuff from you, and you buy sub-components from someone in the US, etc. So there could be some tariffs that you are exposed to, that I'm not exposed to, but through the prices and the supply chain,
Yeah.
that have an impact for me. So this is where it starts to be complicated for procurement people.
It does start to get very complicated, but it is also a very opportunistic strategy that I see, because if some people would say, okay, I'll pass on the full 25%, and then the negotiation is, but why? Because if you look at the total cost of ownership of your product, it only is X of the total product. So that goes back to the old like homework that procurement does, and the question that you and I want to like really go into is, okay, well, what can procurement professionals do? Like, is there something that they can step back and say, okay, this is another drama in the geopolitical setup, but we had dramas before in COVID-19, we had the Suez Canal. In actual fact, there is always going to be upheaval. So as a procurement professional, no matter where the risk and the strain comes from, what should I do in my category, or as a country lead, what is my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step game that I should be doing, and what would you advise people to do in such a situation of such uncertainty?
Yeah, I get to that, and you're right. Is that a lot of the things that we will mention here in terms of action plan around tariff management, they are actually applicable to many other topics. If you think about human rights, you mentioned human rights at the beginning, but this whole regulation we have in the EU or in the UK with the Modern Slavery Act or around that, some of the stuff are common. If you think about carbon management, some of the things are common because it's going back to, I would not say the basics of procurement, but it's really understanding your exposure, and your exposure is based on what am I buying from where. So already understanding that will give you a visibility on your exposure, because if you buy nothing that is coming from the US and that could be exposed to tariffs, then you're probably fine. But the thing that's complicated with human rights, those regulations, with tariff, it's that it's not just about your direct purchases. As I said, you may buy something from the US, so there will be no tariff when you import it into the EU, except if the EU puts tariff, but that's for maybe tomorrow. But those goods you buy from the US, they may be using goods that are imported into the US that have been exposed to tariffs, like the quote I was talking about. So that's why you need, first of all, to have, I would say, on that specific topic, cross-functional approach, because procurement alone won't be able to do everything.
Problem,
yeah, you have to have procurement people, supply chain people, finance people, probably legal, etc. Because there is also a lot of, that's a new thing, is to understand the tariff. Procurement has not been really exposed to that, but you need to go deep into understanding what are the current tariffs, what are the agreements that apply, then do an analysis of what Trump said he would do, how would that come into play. And so you have this cross-functional team that's going to perform a risk and cost impact analysis based on the supply chain network, the origin of goods, the categories of goods, understanding the cost structure, because as we mentioned before, the impact of the tariff could be on just one subcomponent and not on the total product that I'm buying, etc. So it's a whole exercise of supply chain visibility and cost visibility that I would say is basically the remit of procurement, and that you can apply to many other things. And then obviously, once you have, this, I don't know. Hopefully I'm still on. I don't see Victoria anymore. Yeah, okay, so I'm still on. So obviously this supply chain visibility, cost visibility allows organizations to understand where changes in tariff would impact them and how they would impact. And from there, organization, from that visibility and understanding, you can start to develop strategies to mitigate the impacts. That could be, so there could be different ways to mitigate. I would say that there is an approach that is around what I call tariff engineering. And basically it's really by understanding well the mechanism of the tariffs is to leverage what we could call loopholes or the routes that could allow you to avoid tariffs or free trade zones or that kind of stuff. Obviously, supply chain redesign would be an opportunity because, again, tariff applying from goods going from country A to country B, you could change your source so that you source all your suppliers source from a country that is not impacted by tariffs.
Yeah.
And obviously it's something that could be temporary, especially in the period where there are a lot of unknowns. It's potentially stockpiling, so that you have some buffer inventory, so that whatever tariffs apply, you're gonna delay the application, which gives you more time to develop some mitigation action and put them into practice. And I think there could be also a mechanism of really, and I think part of that cross-functional approach I've described before will also require you to have a good communication with stakeholders, because again, it's all about purchase prices and setting prices. So the organization is not just a procurement stuff, but also a strategy for the organization to say, how do we manage?
We lost Victoria for a second there, so she called me in as a speaker. But just one question before I hand you back to Victoria. Do you see supply chain optimizations tools having a role to play in this? Because traditionally we've used them a lot for your warehouse is in the wrong place. This is what better looks like. But I guess you can use them exactly the same to put your supply network in place, adjust the tariffs and say, what does this change?
Yep, exactly. So this is one element we covered as part of this coverage on Spend Matters. We talked about the different tools you have to understand your current state, the potential future state, and the impacts, and then doing what-if analysis, scenarios, etc. And obviously, supply chain redesign is complex, obviously, and there are many factors that you need to take into account. It's not just about price; it could be also carbon, it could be things. So this optimization that you mentioned, optimization tools, that you mentioned, can be key to develop a strategy to mitigate the impact of tariffs, because they will allow you to reposition potentially. I mean, your location, you're gonna maybe long term you could move your factories, but I don't think that's the short term approach. But your sourcing, your preferred sourcing zones per category, and so instead of here, we're gonna go here, or build routes that go around tariffs. And those tools have their role to play in that approach. They are quite advanced. They can serve multiple purposes: tariff, risk supply chain optimization for cost, risk, and all kind of stuff. And they do have a role to play. Not every organization has them, and I think there is a lot you can do without those tools already. But obviously, the next maturity level would be around really when designing supply chain, optimizing supply chain. Then there is a new input, that is the tariff.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'll hand you back to Victoria.
Okay,
hey, Alex, thanks for that. Thanks for jumping in. So, Bertrand, actually, I was thinking somebody was typing. I don't know whether I saw, let me just have a look, whether I saw one of the listeners. Richard may be typing in a question. But guys, if you have any questions, I think my chat still works, but I had to move on to my iPad. The question I wanted to ask you, so yeah, I also wanted to ask you about tools. Like, what are the existing tools that could help procurement managers include this as another risk factor to be aware of, and then churn all the activities? But this is one question I had. The other one I had about the supplier relationship management approach, because as you said correctly, I mean, you can look at your inputs into a product or a service, especially, as you said, more complex is probably a product, not a service, and say, okay, I think this is, I buy from all these tier 1 suppliers and I'm safe from the tariffs. But then they might have tier 2, tier 3 key suppliers that are actually exposed to the tariffs. So what would be your recommendation of, in the current scenario where so much is unknown? Would you, in your opinion, have a dialogue already with the suppliers, or to say, hey, can I understand your supply chain, tier 1s? Or would you wait until they come with we need to increase prices and then negotiate? Like, how would be your approach?
I think, I mean, we already talked about supply chain optimization tools, etc. But I would say that's of the maturity ladder, that's pretty high. I would say that the most fundamental and first step would be to have a clear spend analysis so that you understand, in a granular way, category-wise and country-wise, where are my direct purchases coming from, right? Because if you see that something is coming from, let's say, the US, then the next question is that would the price of what I buy from the US rise because they buy something that tariffs, etc. So I would say the first level is really understanding what I'm buying from where and from whom, obviously. So which is the 101 of spend analysis. And then the next question is around that supply chain illumination or visibility you mentioned, and that we mentioned, because again, it's not just for direct flows that tariff is going to have an impact, but because the economy is connected, everything is networked, etc. It's not supply chain, it's supply network. Then increases will pop here and there, and then they will follow the flow of goods, right? And they will reach you at some point. So that's why you need to have a way to go beyond the tier one suppliers and go and do it in the most granular way possible, so that you can understand the flow of goods, right? And there are tools that do that, and that allow you to, and there are different ways to achieve that supply chain transparency. You can ask your suppliers, just like you said, Victoria. I take my first top suppliers or more critical suppliers in Spain or whatever, or the one I'm thinking that because, aluminum is going to be exposed, and based on the industry, the value chain, I know that potentially there could be something. Then I could contact them and ask them about, provide me some visibility in terms of where you're buying stuff, would that be exposed to tariff increases and that kind of stuff. That's the relationship way, which is important to have. And I would say that also is giving maybe the best results. But obviously you cannot do that for everything and every supplier. And the thing is that once you reach tier 3, 4, 5, then that does not work really. And this is where some solutions exist on the market so that you can provide your direct spend. When I say direct, it's tier 1 spend, and they're going to be able to map and uncover or reveal tier 2, 3, 4, and sometimes up or down to raw materials. So there are solutions. And the thing is that, as we said earlier, if you think about human rights and human labors and regulation that are in place in many countries, UK, Europe, but not just, that do ask companies to do due diligence around, human rights in their supply chain. That's the same thing, actually. So addressing that for human rights or addressing that for tariff, it's the same thing. Actually, you need to understand beyond my tier 1. This is one of the key challenge and headache for supply chain and procurement professional. When you look at, the past few years, is that mainly around sustainability, human rights, and sometimes supply chain resilience with COVID, they are forced to go beyond the tier 1 suppliers and understand what are they buying from who, from where, et cetera, and that can serve the agenda of tariff and cost management, but also ESG, sustainability, carbon, all that kind of stuff. And as I said, there are tools that allow you to get that visibility. And then I would say the next step, just like Alex said it before, is that you take your spend, current spend, your tariff intelligence around what are the tariffs today, how they could evolve tomorrow. You feed that into a big machine and supply chain optimization tool, so that thing takes into account all kind of parameters. Could be tariff, could be carbon, could be geopolitical risk, could be whatever, and optimize everything and define where you could position your buffer, your inventory, and where you could source certain categories.
Yeah, and that's really illuminating, because I was thinking back to the time when I was sitting in Singapore and the Ukraine-Russian war started, and we had to, because we were supplying into Europe, and the US had to declare very, very fast whether we are exposed to any Russian or Belarus products and services. And actually, if you think about it, it's exactly the same thing. It's being able to quickly do that kind of analysis and play back. And then the action is remove yourself, or whatever the action currently is, be prepared for for mitigating that risk. Yeah. You talked about something. You mentioned something fast, which you said that if you proactively speak to your suppliers, it typically brings better results. In your experience, what kind of supplier relationship management or supplier programs typically yield the best results? Is it because there are two negotiation viewpoints and two strategies? Some people say, I'm going to do nothing and wait for the suppliers to come to me. And some others will say, no, I'm going to be proactive because I believe that, and I'm not afraid for them to come, but I want to be prepared. And then I want to craft my negotiation strategy accordingly. Do you see in your experience with talking to so many suppliers, procurement teams, what typically yields the best result?
Well, I would say it depends, because yeah, you can have the wait and see approach and say, until someone is calling me and say your price is going to go up X%, I'm going to do nothing. That's one thing. But I would say being prepared, as you mentioned, Victoria, is important, because then when the phone rings, you need to be able to answer and say, yeah, because again, going back to the aluminum example, if the raw material aluminum is making plus 25%, that does not mean that every component that is using every part and everything made out of aluminum, that all prices will go up plus 25. So if a supplier calls me and say, hey, I have to rise my prices by 25% because you may heard the news, the tariffs, aluminum, 25%, Trump, blah, 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 then I need to be able to answer, yeah, I've heard the news. I know that aluminum is going plus 25, but in the widget you're selling me, aluminum is 10% of the whole thing. The rest is plastic or whatever, etc. So the prices should not go up. The total price should not go up by 25, but by whatever. So I think being prepared is important. And then it's up to you to decide, then based on that preparation, to be like more silent, or to say, I'm going to proactively engage with my suppliers, because first of all, anything could endanger those suppliers if prices are going up on one side and then don't increase the prices on the other side, and maybe their financial health and situation could go bad, and that would be impacted at some point. And yeah, so I would say it's probably do the analysis, do the math, just like we described before, and then based on that, on a case by case, then you can decide on being proactive or not. But I think procurement should be in control of that decision.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the preparation is key, even if you don't have 100%, which we never have, of your supply mapped. The most important critical element should be mapped. You should understand your tier 2, and then you should craft a supplier resilience strategy with your key suppliers. You have to have the negotiation. And I also believe that this crisis, like any old crisis that hits, at the end of the day, finance, supply chain will look at procurement to say, okay, what would you recommend? And it's also, if you have your house in order and all this analysis done, is a great way for procurement to elevate themselves again and say, hey, I have all these scenarios and options that I'd like to propose to you, the business, that could de-risk you. And as I don't know whether we mentioned or not, because there are lots of strategies. For example, you can route the products from the US via other countries into China, and maybe pay less taxes in China if you route it not directly from the US or via something else. So I think there are quite a lot of kind of scenarios on where you, at the end of the day, get the stuff from that could be also potentially worth exploring, right?
Yeah, for sure. There are different ways to mitigate the impacts. We mentioned some of them, like buffer inventory to buffer and delay the impact, or reconsidering where you source from, working collaboratively with suppliers also, because again, your impact could be indirect and through your suppliers. So working with suppliers, sometimes if you're a large organization, you may have means and people and skills and know-how and whatever and tools that are way beyond what your smaller suppliers have. So make them benefit from your expertise, and work with them collaboratively on finding ways to mitigate. So that's, yeah, of course.
So in a nutshell, I think, again, it's pretty much, although it is a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty, if I am to summarize the last 49 minutes, it's all about having your house in order and having the transparency in your supply chain, whatever you buy, and having that, which I'd say health and hygiene of procurement intact, because then you can build strategies on top of that. I want to see if anybody else has any questions before we move on. Wow, Richard. Let's read that. You have access to, Bertrand, you have access to the chat, right? So the impact of Spend could be more severe. Tariffs could be more damaging. Yeah.
So I mean, China has been exposed, as I said earlier. Trump 1 was really focusing a lot on China, on specific categories of goods. Now they have like 10%. I think there are a lot of things also going on in terms of power play between China and the US around like TikTok, Tesla, etc. So there are a lot of factors. I would say what is really new and maybe to procurement professional, especially from Europe and even in the US, obviously, would be more exposed or directly exposed to tariff than buyers in Europe, is the fact that this new wave of tariff is, first of all, we're talking about 25, sometimes %, maybe sometimes even more, based on the analysis that's going to be happening in the next weeks and months from the US administration. But it is targeting traditional allies and partners, and like Canada, Mexico, the US, they had a trade agreement made by Trump, USMCA. So I can imagine that it was quite surprising to have the same guy say that thing that is 4+ years old is the worst agreement ever, and we're gonna throw everything to the trash, and then you get plus 25. So yeah, I guess that's my take on that, is to be prepared, because nobody really knows what's gonna come. And basically the good news, if I can say that, is that everything we described before about what to do, this action plan can be applied to many things and more than tariffs.
I think the other thing I reflect on, Bertrand, is that we need to think in 4-year time periods, because you could be a betting man, you could say he'll stay another term or he'll move, but the reality is he is here for 4 years. And I think the other thing about diversification and stuff that Richard, you're saying about, I would sit back and think, okay, what would disrupt me and cost me more money in the long term? Try to bring on new suppliers now, just in case, because I don't know where to bring them on from, because I don't know what's safe in terms of a country now, an alliance. Or try to stick with my suppliers who are loyal, who actually maybe even are prepared to go open book with me, who will be prepared for long-term agreements, and then make sure that I sail through that 4-year storm or 3.5-year storm, 4-year storm, and then hopefully it'll get me out of there. Because chopping and changing now, and then in 4 years everything again might change, is actually also a high risk strategy. So I think it's a balance between jumping because of all this noise, or sitting back and saying, okay, but let's also project into the future. Because I see some alliances actually forming beyond the typical alliances of companies and their value systems that say, even in climate, 23 or 24 states in the US said, despite us leaving the agreement, we are still in. And Trump left the agreement last time as well, and then Biden came back in. So there will be that yo-yoing on tariffs and on loyalties with different regions. So I think what we need to do is also say, is action going to cost me more and create more risk, or is a slight increase in cost for the next 3 years actually something that is the lower risk option. So we need to also consider that. Ricky was asking about the Eurozone and the relationship with Trump. And that's, I mean, this is only our personal opinions, right? Who knows what's going to happen? But it's interesting how Trump is also getting very political. It's not a trade purge that he's doing with Europe. It's also a political kind of game he's playing. So, yeah, I don't know, Bertrand, what is your kind of prediction on what will happen with US and the Eurozone?
Yeah. So I'll try to answer that question, and I would say that, and go back to what you were saying before on we're considering everything, changing sources, etc. I think the answer in this situation will be very different for buyers, companies buying from the US, because they're going to be exposed to those tariffs, and they should do everything we've talked about. For companies based in the EU, they could be exposed to stuff bought and then exported through the US. I think the main agenda for Europe-based companies, and when I say Europe, it's UK and even Asia, etc., will be that if tariffs are exposed to companies that sell product into the US, then Procurement is going to be back on the hot seat in terms of fighting inflation like we had back in the days, and finding cost savings to try to offset as much as possible the tariffs that the product would be exposed to. So I think there would be two different, for procurement professional based in the US or in Europe, the situation would be a bit different. One being maybe resourcing, changing, finding ways to optimize the supply chain. And for Europe would be potentially to offset the negative impact of tariffs on prices of the goods the company sells to the US, right? And for the EU, well, we'll see. I think they are working on it. I think there are a lot of stuff also going on with Ukraine, NATO. So I think it's a very difficult situation, and I can only imagine that some of the stuff that were announced in Munich or said in Munich were quite surprising too for a lot of people, especially in Europe. So I think all of that is somehow connected, I hope, or maybe it's not. But I think for now it's a huge, I don't know, poker game where a lot of announcements are made to try to set some position and maybe gain somewhere else. So yeah, so difficult to say how the EU will be impacted and how it will respond. I think the least that the EU and maybe in the greater sense of EU should try to be aligned at least, because one thing that Trump is using is the fact that the economy in the US is one of the strongest, largest in the world, and is using that as a threat, market access, etc. So, and the EU is actually quite a big market, but the issue of the EU is that it's still multiple states that need to align, and I hope they will align to find a way to have one common response to provide some weight into and leverage into the negotiations.
I think you're right. Let's leave this with a message of hope, because from my experience and what I've read, there was a huge economic damage actually from Brexit for the UK. UK went into recession because of Brexit. Now we have enough data to showcase that this is pretty much a fact, right? I do believe that the Eurozone acting together, and that's the reason why they got together in the first place, can actually balance out either a China or a US. What he's doing now is subdividing, dividing and conquering, and it's the oldest game in the book, right? Like, he's playing to Italy but destroying Germany. If they do fall apart, that would be a huge loss for Europe. But he is hitting them hard where they are very emotive, right? But if they can stick together, that would be the show of strength, and that would then mean that the Eurozone is going to be stronger for sure, politically, but also economically. They are so intertwined now, fortunately or unfortunately. It's difficult to say. So I hope that we can leave this podcast with a message of hope and plea to the Eurozone to stay strong and actually be factual, rather than rather than be emotional like he is and asking, and he's provoking immediate reaction, right? Which, of course, doesn't play a lot into the hand of unity. We probably, yeah, Alex, just for your point, it's complicated by the COVID effect for sure, but I think we have enough stats to show that even despite of COVID, Brexit hit Europe pretty hard. But happy to have a different podcast unpicking Brexit and the economic impact of that. But for now, with only a minute to go, I love the discussion. It's such a complex topic. So thank you so much for giving us your opinion, your clarity, your, and actually also calming us all down a bit and say, guys, it's just another risk for us procurement professionals. We will see other risks emerging. So supply chain mapping, total cost of ownership analysis, and having the right tech to be able to pivot fast, and the relationships is key. So I want to thank you guys so much for your comments and questions. Alex, thank you so much for jumping in. I hope that the recording is going to be available when I press end. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions, and have an awesome rest of the week.
Thank you. Have a good day.